The subject I'd like to address this evening is one which can elicit strong views, but when probed, often leads to an ethical dilemma and ultimately a personal choice. I refer to the questions linking the reduction of population growth and the eradication of poverty. Questions looking at global numbers and environmental sustainability, to the controversy surrounding state-administered family size versus individual choice, and to whether or not here in Australia you should be having one child for her, one child for him, and one for the nation, as Peter Costello is alleged to have said, or none at all, as was recently called for by, and I quote, the voluntary human extinction movement. Indeed, was Dick Smith right when he advocated for zero population growth if the human race is to cope? Mind you, it wasn't always so complicated as these debates would indicate. In the book of Genesis, written 3,000 years ago, when there would have been only a few million people on earth, humankind was called upon to be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea and the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moveth upon the earth. So it says in Genesis. Well, multiply we did, to the point where the Reverend Thomas Malthus, a brilliant mathematician and fellow of Jesus College, Cambridge, published in 1798 a momentous essay on the principle of population. In this, Malthus articulated a simple conclusion which has become known as the dismal theorem. The power of population, he wrote, is infinitely greater than the power in the earth to produce subsistence for man. Population, when unchecked, increases in a geometrical ratio. Subsistence increases only in an arithmetical ratio. This inequality between the two must be felt by a large portion of mankind. Important to note is that when Malthus wrote, world population was measured in millions. But today we are living in a world of unprecedented demographic growth. Consider the following. The world symbolically chosen 7 billionth was born in a packed government-run hospital in the Philippines on Monday the 31st of October last year. Her name is Donica May Camacho, and she weighed 2.5 kilograms. She looks so lovely, her mother said. I can't believe she is the 7 billionth. The 6 billionth baby, Adnam Nevic in Bosnia, was chosen at random from the 80 million born in 1999, 12 years prior to the 7 billionth. Adnan recently told an interviewer that his favourite subject was geography, and that he hoped with the birth of the 7 billionth child it would, and I quote, bring peace to the world, end of quote. The 5 billionth addition to global population was born in 1987 and also in the former Yugoslavia, in Zagreb, with a 4th billionth baby being born in 1974 and the 3 billionth 14 years earlier in 1960. There were only 2 billion people in 1927, and it took the whole of human history until 1804 to reach the point at which 1 billion people inhabited the planet at the same time. The increase from now, 2012, over the next 40 years is close to the size of world population in 1950. And most of that growth is taking place in the less developed country and concentrated among the poor living in cities. Population growth from now is overwhelmingly in urban areas. So how do you explain this increase in recent decades in the less developed countries? What's the answer? Lower mortality. People don't die in the numbers that they once did. Longer life expectancy. People are just living longer. Consider your parents and your grandparents, and you have part of the answer. And you have a youthful population in countries where fertility remains high. The population pyramid in most developing countries is at the lower end of the scale. That's where the bulk of the population is, the youth. Important to note, however, is that many middle-income countries, that is, those countries where per capita income is greater than $12.50 per year. That's how you measure the move from lower income to middle income, by measuring per capita income, 1,250. Those middle income countries are racing through the same demographic transition now as rich ones, but they are starting at an earlier stage in their development and moving more quickly. The transition from a rate of 5 births per woman in the reproductive age to that of 2, which took 130 years to happen in Britain from 1800 to 1930, took just 20 years from 1965 to 1985 in South Korea. In some other countries, and here I think you'll be interested to hear, the most dramatic illustration is Iran. The speed of decline in the fertility rate has been astonishing. In Iran, the number of women born per woman in the reproductive age was 7 in 1984. It's now 1.9 or less. 1.9 was reached in 2006. This is the fastest drop in fertility that has ever been known, and is as fast as social change can happen. And it happened in Iran. By contrast, the overall population of the more developed countries is likely to show little change over the next 40 years, remaining at about 1.2 billion. Whenever I talk of figures, I'm reminded of that quote that's attributed to Stalin. I mean, how do you get your head around millions and billions? I think Stalin's reputed to have once said that one person's death's a tragedy, a million is a statistic. How do you get your head around a billion? But anyway, there's a comment on Stalin really, and what he was infamously reputed for, 30 billion deaths in the last century. Anyway, a topic for another occasion. Developed countries, little change in their population size. In those countries, fertility is already below replacement level. How do you measure replacement level? 2.1 children per woman is replacement level. And that's the case in all 45 developed countries or areas. The population of developed regions is also aging and would actually decline were it not for migration. The populations of Germany, Italy, Japan, and most of the successor states of the former Soviet Union are expected to be lower in 2050 than they are today. But despite these declines in the more developed countries, many believe that with a global population advancing to such levels, Malthus's thesis still holds true. Because we live on a finite planet, the argument goes, there has to be a limit. 9 billion plus people just cannot go on consuming at the same rate as we do now. In short, there are too many people for the Earth's fragile ecosystems. With food and water supplies under challenge, growing pollution, major climatic upheavals, ageing populations, and more than 1 billion people living below the poverty line, can we, as a human race, continue to muddle through? Isn't it time to stop and ideally reverse the population increase? I would like to answer this question by looking at country level. If a nation has too big a population, then its capacity to feed, clothe and shelter its inhabitants is presumed to be severely restricted. Look at Niger in Africa, for example, where the population growth is 3.9, and compare this with Australia with a growth rate of 1.1. Add to this the need to satisfy basic requirements, the constraints placed upon economic development by a population growing faster than its gross domestic product, and you can see why the Chinese go to such lengths to limit population growth, to the point where it does not negate their economic achievements. Then again, as I indicated earlier, there are also many countries dealing with declining population, 17 in fact, and for them they are looking at population sizes which will be substantially lower than what they are currently. Take Japan, for example. Its population is estimated to fall from 127 million now to 102 million by mid-century. So concerned is the Japanese government about this that it is offering $160 per child per month incentive. But still their economy struggles, and finding sufficient jobs for their population remains a challenge. If the Japanese incentive program sounds familiar, it is because we too in Australia, as you know, have a child endowment policy. Well, why is this? Because, the argument goes, as a sparsely populated country, Australia needs more people for filling the skills gap, for security, for sustaining consumption, for generating a vibrant multicultural society, and for offsetting our ageing population. In fact, so concerned is the Business Council of Australia about this challenge that in December 2010, their president declared that what we needed for a strong economy was well-planned population growth. Human ingenuity, said the BCA president, will see us through when we face a 35 million population size. But will it? Other than administrating immigration policy, how does any government exercise control over population growth rates? Can you coerce people into having fewer babies or having more babies? Do you use taxes, for example, to limit numbers or expand them? Indeed, is it any of the state's business how many children a couple have or choose not to have? The answer to that question came in Cairo in 1994, when 179 countries at the International Conference on Population and Development approved a program of action. This global landmark agreement declared that, and I quote, reproductive healthcare programs should provide the widest range of services without any form of coercion. All couples and individuals have the basic right to decide freely and responsibly the number and spacing of their children, and to have the information, education, and means to do so. Put simply, this principle declared that the decision to have children, when and how many, was none of the state's business. But how do you reconcile this with China's one-child policy, or Vietnam's two, whereby the state tells you how many children you can have, when you can have them, and severely punishes you should you break with the regulations? How do you reconcile state interventions in people's reproductive lives with the individual liberties espoused at Cairo? For the Chinese, the answer is clear, although historically it wasn't also always so. Since the 1970s, the Chinese Communist Party's position has been that advancing economic development for more than 1 billion people, now 1.3 billion, meant that any couple having more children than their quota, to give it the literal translation, quota, was inflicting a cost on a poor and developed country that could not be ignored. Chairman Mao's view was that you cannot move people out of poverty if population growth outstrips economic development. Be socially irresponsible, the policy has said for the last 40 years, means you have to pay. The alternative is starving people landing on foreign shores, on Christmas Island, for example. Going further, the Chinese say that enunciating such a population policy is our sovereign right, consistent with national laws and development priorities. As such, there is no contradiction with the stated principles laid out in the Programme of Action adopted in Cairo in 1994. Indeed, for the Chinese government, that Programme of Action provides, and I quote, the guiding principles for population and family planning programs for the entire world. Let me just briefly tell you how the Chinese program works, and one during my 5 years in China I was negotiating with the government. The Chinese encourage delaying the age of marriage, a good thing you might say, and delaying the age of first birth, also perhaps a good thing. But then every Chinese has a place of registration, which is called their hukou in Chinese. The policy is set nationally, but the practice, the implementation of the policy, is set provincially and determined by your place of registration, your hukou. And crudely, throughout the country, it says that in your 4th year of marriage, you can apply for your quota. So you go at your workplace or in your village to the responsible person as a couple, and you apply to have a birth. If you're given permission, which is typically given in your 4th year of marriage, and you successfully have a pregnancy, and if that pregnancy is a boy, then typically 2 weeks after you have you'll have a safe delivery, an IUD is inserted, an intrauterine device. The wife will carry that device typically for 10 years, at which point, if that child is happy and healthy, you'll have encouraged to have a tubal ligation, a tubectomy. Now, if your place of registration is in a city, that's the end of the story. That's your one child that we talk about, and that covers about 40% of Han Chinese, which are about 80% of the population. If you're a farmer and registered as such as a farmer, and your first child in your 4th year of marriage is a girl, you can apply in your 8th year of marriage, birth spacing being encouraged, for a second delivery. And if that second delivery is a boy, hallelujah, you've got the ideal family, a boy and a girl. If it's a second girl, well, do you register that child? Do you use illegally ultrasound for sex determination and have an abortion? These are big issues that the Chinese grapple with, but you follow the same regimen 2 weeks after the birth, an IUD, and as I've described. If you're a member of an ethnic minority, of whom there's 80 to 100 million, the same regimen, but you can have 3. If you're a Han Chinese and you live in Lhasa in Tibet, it's one child. But if you're a Tibetan, there's no restrictions. That's essentially how it works. And if you don't follow that regimen as I've described, and you have a pregnancy that's not approved, then there's all sorts of regulations brought to bear. And where you've probably read about many of the abuses that happen, which, as I say, concerns the Chinese authorities as much as it does here. The Vietnamese think very much like the Chinese. They have a 2-child policy, which typically applies for anyone who's in any way connected with the government. In December 2000, the Vietnamese government approved a new national population strategy covering the 15 years from 2000 to 2015. The first principle of that strategy says, I quote, population activities are an important part of the development strategy of the country and are the major factor for improving living standards for each person, family, and the entire society, end of quote. Such state intervention in people's private lives in the cause of population and development is, however, something that we find difficult to get our heads around, and certainly was contrary to the view of Tony Abbott. When he was asked about the Chinese program, he replied, and I quote, governments cannot and should not try to dictate people's reproductive choices, end of quote. So what is the answer to this perplexing question? Is there a direct correlation between population growth and economic development? Are population sustainable development and poverty alleviation symbiotically linked? My answer to this question is a relatively simple one, but hugely challenging. Central to both individual advancement and balanced development for any country is empowering women and meeting people's needs in reproductive health. By advancing gender equality through keeping girls in secondary school, and one of the MDG, the Millennium Development Goals, talks about keeping girls in primary school. But the evidence is overwhelming that what really matters is keeping girls in secondary school. That is what makes the difference. Not necessarily, as we're now seeing, overcrowding the number of students in primary schools. You have to keep girls in secondary school. If you can delay the age of girls' marriage and at the date at which they have their first birth, plus simultaneously eliminating violence against women and ensuring women's ability to control their own fertility, governments can play a central role in efforts to ensure economic sustainability. Women are the answer to the population question, as they are indeed to most things. For a developing country, when these initiatives are coupled with broader investments in basic education, sanitation, safe drinking water, housing, adequate food supply and infrastructure for growing populations, all underpinned by sound demographic indicators, you have a combination for the eradication of poverty, which in turn will continue to the slowing of population. Slower population growth then gives countries more time to adjust to future population increases, enhancing countries' ability to further tackle poverty, protect the environment, and facilitate future sustainable development. Evidence that countries in Southeast Asia, where average incomes grew significantly faster, where population growth was comparatively slow than in those where population growth was more rapid. Studies attribute about 1/4 of the miracle growth in the Southeast Asian region after 1960, and 1/3 of the increase in per capita income to a demographic bonus, a larger percentage of workers compared to dependents resulting from fertility declines. In many countries of Africa, where fertility remains high, the dependency ratio has not yet begun to decline. To conclude, sometime in the next few years, if it hasn't happened already, the world will reach a milestone. Half of humanity will be having only enough children to replace itself. That is, the fertility rate of half the world will be 2.1 or below. The move to replacement level fertility is one of the most dramatic social changes in history. Everywhere, it is changing traditional life by enabling women to work and children to be educated. The absolute number of people is, however, still rising by a forecast of 2.4 billion over the next 40 years. And where living standards have not yet risen, fertility rates will continue to rise and continue to be high. Every week, an extra 1.5 million people is added to world population. Providing contraception to all women who want it would cost comparatively little at an estimated $6 billion to $7 billion US a year. That's less than what is spent annually celebrating Halloween. Thank you.
Thank you. That was fantastic, and I'm glad Ian mentioned that women have the answer to most things, because when Ian asked if he could, from his wife, have permission to come and address us this evening, it was done so in the context of the fact that today is Ian's wedding anniversary, so she said yes. I'm also grateful, Ian, that you made mention to Peter Costello's urging of us to have 3 children, one for the hubby, one for the missus, and one for the country. And maybe an anecdote that Costello said at the last election, he was in a shopping centre, and a bloke approached him and said, "Well, Peter, I've had one for me, I've had one for the missus, I've had one for the country. When are you coming to pick it up?" So I think I'd like now to throw it open to questions, please.
John Benson, member of the Institute. So I understand the demise of virtually every other past culture has been the excess fertility of less intelligent people. We're having problems in Australia at the moment. You probably know that 1 in 3 Australians are on some form of income support. It'll soon be 1 in 2, because low-paid workers and pensioners are having nearly 5 times more children than the rest of the population. And as far as pensioners are concerned, their children are 5 times more likely to be on a pension. This problem is only being addressed by China, as far as I know. And one other thing about China, I understand if you have money, you can have as many children as you like if you pay the government.
Well, let's take the second one. Corruption is perhaps a topic for another occasion, and the Chinese would certainly admit there's corruption, and that officials can be bribed in order to increase the number of children that you can have. But I think if we can talk generally about China, that's not happening. There's certainly wealthy who are bribing their way, and there are certainly people who are not subject, who manage somehow to avoid those regulations. But the decline in the Chinese population has been dramatic. And of course it's diverting for a moment, it's had its unintended consequences which the government is now addressing. because of the one-child policy, we now have an abnormal number of boys being born to girls. The sex ratio at birth in normal circumstances is 106 boys to 100 girls. And because infant mortality amongst boys is higher than girls, it tends to even out. In China, you're getting 112 to 120, and in some places 150. Now that can only happen through human intervention, and typically through ultrasound for sex determination. But we now have a situation where estimates range from there are 80 million more boys, if not higher, than girls. And we have an enormous boom in the sex industry in China. We have the whole problem of what are called the little emperors, these overindulged, overweight boys who are subject to huge pressure from their parents in order to succeed and care for them in older age. And again, I'll come back to your question of diversion. The Chinese have modified their rule at the moment. So if you're a one child, and your father was a one child, and your mother was a one child, and you marry a one child whose father was a one child, and mother a one child, you're allowed to have two. So they've made that important modification. But there are many consequences of this policy. But the Chinese, as I've said, you know, not only, we could never have achieved what we have achieved if we had a policy that allowed people to have whatever number. We'd like to have whatever number, but it's simply not possible. Now, when I was in China, the government decided to bring down what they called literally a eugenics law. It was called literal, the translation is a eugenics law. And it essentially said that the use of ultrasound amniocentesis would determine the health of the fetus, and if it was decided that the fetus was not as it should be, then abortion would be undertaken. Morally acceptable? Smacks of Hitler and Nazism and so on. The outcry, rightly in my view, around the world said this is just not on, this is unacceptable. Mind you, many countries historically have had eugenics law. It's interesting to look back. And also when I talk about sex ratio at birth, China's not the only example. We have a dramatic illustration in India, where again ultrasound is illegal for sex determination. And we have radically more boys being born than girls. A huge problem in India. It was a huge problem in South Korea. But now the South Korean parents are saying, girls look after us better in our old age. We made a mistake. We need to correct this. And now it's equalising that sex ratio. Viet Nam has a similar problem. So I could never advocate a eugenics law. And I certainly could never see Australia making a decision that about who has how many children, when they have them, and to introduce something along those lines. Yeah.
Thank you. Could I just ask you to also give your name as you ask the question? Yes, sir. Thank you.
Professor Howie, Bob Foster from Queenscliff, but if you speak slowly, I will understand you.
I'm sorry if I'm speaking too fast.
My question relates to when Jan and I lived in Doha, GATA had a per capita income 150% of that in Australia, but Gattari women had 6.4 live births per woman, and in Australia at that time it was 1.8. What's going on?
Well, certainly fertility is high throughout the Arab world, but there are many countries that are exceptions, and I just cited Iran, which is an extraordinary story in that area. I don't know anything about Doha. I did, in fact, at one stage wrote a small booklet on Islam and family planning. Islam, and many of you here will know more about it than I, is not a hierarchical religion. So you can't see a leader of the church bringing down an edict as to whatever moral issue it might be. Much depends on what the local mullah interprets the Quran and the Hadiths about this story. The one source on gender issues, including fertility and so on, is an institute in Cairo, which is generally used throughout the Muslim world as the ultimate authority, if indeed there is one, on interpreting the Quran. And as many scholars would say, the Quran is very supportive of gender issues and of women, contrary to popular interpretation. And in fact, the Prophet Muhammad was once asked by one of his military commanders about what should be the practice when we have sex with a concubine and we have an unwanted birth. And the Prophet said you should practice what is known as azl in Arabic, which literally means you should spill your seed upon the ground, which means coitus interruptus. And that's now talked of to give some understanding when looking at Islam and family planning that you shouldn't go on having whatever number of children that you want. And the Prophet also said you shouldn't have more children than you can feed, clothe and shelter. A very wise edict, I would have thought.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lawrence. Bill Pickford Ian of the Institute. Behind you on the wall, 2 photographs. Now, all those massive cities, which are excessive population is happening, are using up some of the best arable ground in the country. There's a tremendous need from the other side of the coin to be able to produce more in this world and produce it more efficiently. And that is just one of the aspects of planning, as well as far more efficient development of agricultural practice to produce the food we need. I think it's a two-edged sword, and I found the 2 photos interesting and provocative. How do you think?
Yes, they are. And I said most of the increase in world population in this century is going to happen in cities. I think, if I recall, by 2030, 60% of world population, will be in cities. And that's where the numbers are rising. People are going to move to cities. In China, you're looking at about 200 million people are moving from rural areas to urban areas, and the Chinese are encouraging that. Standards of living, no matter how appalling you might think the slums of the cities are, even if you're in Kibera or the Mathara Valley in Nairobi, the Kibera Valley, not the Mathara Valley, is the biggest slum in the world. But people, in fact, have a better standard of living, despite the appalling nature of that slum, than they do in the rural area. It's something that governments are going to have to cope with. I think, in support of what you said, there's a city of about 1 million being added every week, I think, at this moment. And how we cope with all the environmental issues, and you know better than I, the issues that cities have to cope with, is a massive undertaking. How we do it. How Melbourne copes is an issue. I mean, the whole debate of our agricultural land, and the mining industry and so on. How do you resolve that here? And it's tough enough for us. How does a developing country, how does Nigeria do it for Lagos? How can you prevent people from moving from rural urbans to cities? And this whole question about population, I mean, this whole ethical question, how can we claim we want one edict, one ethical statement for the Chinese or for people moving from rural poverty to urban squalor, and another for ourselves? It's just an enormous dilemma. And I think we have to work on that first before we can sort of deal with. But there's no doubt the numbers in poverty have been reduced in the last 2 decades. And that's because of China and India. But the gap between the rich and the very poor is increasing. And there is still 1 million living in total poverty who don't have enough to eat every day. We still have, depending on your estimates, various estimates, 500,000 women who die every year giving birth. And this for me was no more illustrated, and I know we had Joe Chandler from The Age talking recently. In Australia, the figure's about 7 women per 100,000 live births die. You measure maternal mortality by the number of women who die per 100,000 live births. In Australia, it's roughly 7. In Papua New Guinea, it's 732. The biggest threat to a woman's life is dying giving birth in Papua New Guinea. 50% of district health stations are not functioning, and a woman typically gives birth lying on the floor of her hut with her grandmother rubbing her back. In Afghanistan, it's about 1,400, which is the highest in this part of the world, in Asia. In Darfur, it's 2,200. So that gives you some idea of the issues that we're dealing with. Maternal mortality, Millennium Development Goal number 5, is the Millennium Development Goal that's least likely. Well, it won't be achieved. It's the greatest failure and a blot on all of us.
That's a good question, Bill. Even with Melbourne's population due to nearly double from 4.5 million currently to 8 million by 2050, that sort of baked in that will happen. Lagos's population, Lagos will become the world's largest city at 30 million in the next couple of years. Just extraordinary growth. So, a question from the side of the audience. Thank you.
Sue Hudson, I'm a GP. Isn't the greatest threat to population the unexpected, like infectious disease, especially going through an urban slum area?
Let me get my head around this. The greatest
threat, the factor that's going to reduce population the most, is epidemic disease, new epidemics.
Well, you're probably better placed to answer that question than I do. I think of the epidemics that we know about, and there may be those that we don't know about. We have, as you know, eradicated smallpox. We're close to eradicating, if not already, polio, although there's still some cases being found. Malaria, of course, is still takes millions of lives every year. HIV and AIDS has now declined in terms of numbers.
Rate of increase has decreased.
Yes, the rate of increase, yeah, fair enough. And just a little aside here, in 2010, in Australia, I think there were about 1,200 new cases of HIV. So let's not think that it's a problem over there, somewhere over there, and not here. The most interesting advance in treating HIV is the discovery that your chances of HIV infection fall by about 60% if you're circumcised. And this is now an issue of great interest, particularly in Southeast Africa, where the highest rates of HIV to be found. HIV, when it comes to full-blown AIDS, of course, is catastrophic, and you die from that unless you're on antiretrovirals. But for those who work in the area of reproductive health, the focus on HIV in some ways has taken the spotlight away from sexually transmitted diseases, which infects far more people, particularly women around the world, in far greater numbers. And it's taken the focus away from reproductive tract infections, which in many countries can affect 60 to 80% of all women and make their life a misery. And where you have an RTI reproductive tract infection like thrush or chlamydia and so on, if there's any blood associated, then it's a natural entry point for HIV and AIDS. But nobody ever talks about reproductive tract infections.
Your figures on maternal mortality are not as I understand them. I understand that a very large number of women under the maternal mortality banner die from unsafe abortion, not in childbirth. And they don't have access to safe abortion or even to family planning. And that in fact there's a growing opposition, particularly from the United States, to prevent contraception. And so, I have a question though.
Okay, I can answer that one. The major cause of maternal mortality is postpartum hemorrhage. I think that's overwhelming. Would you agree with that? Yeah, thank you. Unsafe abortion is a terrible blight, and in my view, well, anybody's view, I mean, no woman would ever go and use abortion as a means of contraception. An unsafe abortion, and the number of women who
many women use unsafe abortion as a form of contraception.
Yeah, and it's just appalling. An unsafe abortion, even in countries where it's legal, it is just a terrible thing. Of course, the debate goes on here in Australia. Every time a Republican president comes to power in the US, literally within the first week of taking up office, they cut the funding to the United Nations Population Fund and to the International Planned Parenthood Federation, whose Australian affiliate is Family Planning Australia. And they do so for two reasons. One, because they accuse the United Nations of supporting abortion, even in countries where it's legal. And two, because the United Nations is in China, where abortion is legal. When a Democrat comes to power, as Obama did, on the fourth day of his presidency, he restored funding to both these organisations. And I can assure you that if a Republican comes to power at the November election, the same thing will happen. Now, lest you think that debate's combined is solely the case in the US, the debate goes on here in Australia. We had, for a long period of time, Senator Harradine, who held the balance of power in the Senate. And such was his support on abortion, his opposition to abortion and the Right to Life movement, that the gag rule was put on AusAid, Australian Aid Board, that none of it could in any way go to support abortion, even in countries where abortion was legal, and even to address issues of complications arising from illegal abortions. When the Labor Party came to power and they waited to see what Obama would do, and he lifted what's called the gag rule, the Labor Party, the Labor government announced that they would do likewise, but in fact they didn't enact the change for something like 9 to 10 months, because there was a debate going on in the Labor caucus on this whole issue of abortion, but they ultimately did. So it's a very interesting issue, and there's someone in the audience who knows as much about these issues from Oxfam as I know on this big issue.
Well,
Eve, I think you had a supplementary.
yes,
Yeah.
I did. I know. I'm aware of the link between secondary education for girls in developing countries and less fertility and such. But I'm absolutely fascinated, and I've never been able to find out why women have children. And if they've been I mean, in the end, it's a woman's decision either to have a child or not to have a child, because they go to great pains not to have a child if they don't want it. But I'm not aware of research that actually asks women, not couples, not men, just women, why they have children in certain circumstances.
Well, should we go around and ask them?
Straw poll.
In our audience. It's a very interesting question.
It is. I mean, in developing countries, they have more children, and the reason that's been given is because the children die and they need to be supported in their old age. But I've recently heard that in Norway, where women probably have the most equal participation in the workforce than any other country in the world, the fertility rate is going up. And I find the whole area absolutely fascinating, and my husband and I have had some discussions about why couples have children. What is it that actually...
I think it's DNA, don't you think?
Well, we could debate that.
Recreate.
But in the opening of my address, I actually quoted a group that's been publicised recently and says that we should stop having children, that we owe it to the earth to stop having, and they're very vocal.
Another question from this side. Yes, so thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Howie. My name is Hashim Abdul Hamid from Monash Asia Institute. At the Institute, as you are aware, we do bother with these kind of things, especially population growth and so on and so forth. Particularly, you mentioned in passing about India. There were so many people up there, as somebody mentioned it to me, you can count, and there are too many because one died, the other one will be two, will take his place. The reason behind it all is that it's populating the world. When Britain took over India as its colony, many of the people stayed in Britain at present, Uganda, Southeast Asia, west, north, east of New South Wales and Fiji. Lots of Indian workers, and even to the present day, our taxis are being driven by the Indians. These are skilled people, therefore they are useful to the countries. My question is, whether the population is growing slowly or quickly, or cut them off because to replace the old people like us, but it is good for the economy. What's happening to our economy in Australia, if it were not for the Chinese, we can sell the bloody thing around, produce as much as possible. I think there is an important correlation with this. I don't know whether you agree with me.
Yeah, forgive me, I'm not entirely sure the nature of the question.
Yeah, the question is, population growth is good for the country. Unlike us here in Australia, we have to import the Yanks to defend our coast in Darwin and those things. What's wrong?
Well, what is indeed wrong? I mean, we know in Australia women are marrying later. We know that they're having fewer children and they're having later, and that our population's ageing, and that it's through immigration that we're able to sustain a population increase. We know that in India, that standards of living have improved. People are being lifted out of poverty. The Indian population growth rate is falling. And of course, India had its own experiment during the time of Sanjay Gandhi, where they had a program of enforced sterilizations, and there was an enormous backlash, and the Congress party lost power. But again, I would say that the success of India and the reduction in population growth is due and will always be due to women's emancipation. It's all about giving women choices. Women have choices in our country, not all women, but we aim to give women choices. If you give women choices, that's what makes the difference.
Yes, ma'am, please. Next round.
Fiona Cochran, GP. Iran, what happened to reduce the rate in Iran over that period?
I mean, I looked at the data. I mean, it's just a fascinating story with Iran. I mean, this is not a coercive policy. I think the explanation, it comes back to my central thesis. Secondary education is almost universal in Iran. There are more women in universities in Iran than men.
Kerala, the Kerala model?
Same. And Kerala is interesting because Kerala has the highest per capita education is predominant in Kerala. So they have a very high female literacy and education. So girls are well educated. It's Catholic. That's interesting. It's the most Christianized of Indian provinces. Is that a factor? People would suggest it is. It's had for many years a communist provincial government who were particularly supportive of women's education and of family planning. Also said to be factors. That's, I think, sums up the experience of Kerala.
Where is Kerala?
It's the southernmost.
Right.
Yeah. Kerala, here we are. They eat a lot of rice. Up in the north they eat wheat. Do you think that's possibly the explanation? Kerala's down in the south there.
Thank you. Next question from Frank.
Frank Marlowe. I understand that there's a very high correlation between literacy and reductions in the birth rates. And Bob Foster asked the question about Doha. And what is happening is that with the advent of things, even things like mobile telephones, which are pervaded through most of places in Asia and Africa, that people are starting to read.
Absolutely.
And can you comment on that? Is that your...
Well, yeah, I think mobile phones are transforming development. I mean, you have the Grameen Bank in Bangladesh working particularly with landless people and people, low income, rural people, and the success of income generating projects all through mobile phones. In Kenya, people are now, there are far more mobile phones in Nigeria and Kenya than landlines, and people are doing all their banking on mobile phones.
But there's a difference. What I'm saying is it's not necessarily going through secondary school, or that's a help, but it is just the act of being literate.
Yes, but literate's important, I think, but I think beyond literacy into secondary school is the great empowering thing. But yes, literacy, of course, is a radical transformation in people's lives, particularly women's lives.
What's the link?
Just, we'll have two more questions if I could. So who's aggrieved? Who's been putting up their hand that I haven't picked up so far? You're aggrieved, right? If you give your name apart from being aggrieved, that would thank you.
That was me, yes. Professor Howie, Justin Boyd, London University. My question is perhaps broad, and I apologise in advance for that. However, what impact do you imagine climate change may have on population growth in the 21st century? James Lovelock, as environmental scientist, has commented that as the 21st century progresses, we'll see a decimation, perhaps rather provocatively, a decimation of the human population. Do you imagine that's what we'll see, and do you imagine that may be reflected, particularly in the developing countries who are rather exposed to environmental degradation and climate change? Do you imagine that's what we'll see reflected in population growth as the 21st century progresses?
I'd really like to be able to answer that question, but I suspect I'm like many here this evening. I don't know the answer. I'm no expert in climate change. I give credence to the fact that 96% of eminent science around the world say climate change is happening and it's something that we have to deal with. It's surely a subject that we've had discussed in the past here at the Institute, and we no doubt need to have again, but I'm not sufficiently qualified to answer that. I'm sorry.
Well, we can squeeze in two more questions. So you at the back. Thank you.
Thank you. Robert Willett, I'm an investor. What's your opinion now on the ideal population for Australia and the globe? We've heard all the statistics, could we have an opinion now?
Yeah, I knew that would come up. Do we have to ask, what is his name? Who's the Minister for Agriculture and his...
Joe Ludwig.
Sorry?
Joe Ludwig is agriculture.
No, not Joe Ludwig. Tony Burke. Tony Burke. Yeah. Tony Burke, who's been appointed with, amongst his responsibilities for population. he's been asked many times, what's the ideal population for Australia? He doesn't give an answer. What is the ideal population for Australia? I don't have an answer either. And even if there was an answer, my thesis...
higher or lower than we are at the moment?
Better.
Well, let's ask the audience. This is my cop-out. Who thinks it should be higher than what it is at the moment? Put your hand up. Should be higher. Okay. Who thinks it should say what it is? Now hold on, I'll give you 3 choices. Who thinks it should stay what it is now? Okay. Who thinks it should be lower?
Flannery said it should be 8 and Jared Diamond said it should be 10 million.
Okay. So here we go. The bulk think it should be more. There's some who thinks it's okay now, and a sizable minority thinks it should be lower. Well, this is a debate that has to go on in the public domain. How many can Australia support, given we are the fragile continent? What sort of numbers could we support? Do we have a responsibility for immigrants, whether they come through the official program or through whatever other means? Do we have a responsibility to take people from around the world who are struggling in areas of poverty and so on? You know, a wonderful subject for a debate.
Yeah, the last question you've got. Yes, thank you.
Hi, I'm Zan Maxwell. I'm also from Melbourne University. I'd just like to get your thoughts on perhaps, if you can, the relationship between population and the scarcity of oil. As we know, since the discovery and widespread utilisation of oil, population has increased exponentially with it. Through the use of fertilizers and the ability to transport food and stuff like that.
Agricultural production's increased.
Yes, largely because of oil, and among other things, oil has helped the population explode. You can see graphs at it. The point where oil goes like that, so does the population. By the look on your face, I'm not sure if you...
yeah, okay, let me hear.
Okay, so I'm just sort of, as a lot of people seem to be convinced that we're reaching a point where there's going to be peak oil. When that runs out and starts to decline, there's going to be a discrepancy between the number of people that have been able to come into existence because of its that energy. But when it goes, the only thing that I can see happening is widespread famine, because those people are going to keep living longer than there's oil available to support their existence.
Well, in a sense, that's a nice segue into some of my opening remarks when I talked about Malthus, who, of course, said that you can't sustain rates of population growth with capacity to feed, clothe and shelter and so on. I looked at you sceptical because, to be honest, I've never really looked at the thesis that as oil production goes up, population growth goes up, and once oil starts to decline, then the capacity to use all the products that come with oil in order to provide for growing populations.
It isn't oil, it's energy.
Energy.
It doesn't have to be oil.
Yeah. I see. Okay. I don't have an answer for that. My immediate thoughts go, well, what's going to happen in Papua New Guinea with the LPG project comes on? It's an enormous development in Papua New Guinea now. They're going to have massive income from that scheme. Is that going to have repercussions on population size? I don't know. We'll have to watch the space.
Nigeria's got oil.
Pardon?
Nigeria's got oil.
Yeah, sure. I mean, population slowing in Nigeria. It's coming down.
Ian, a great presentation. Thank you very much indeed. I love the way that, perhaps in a way, you did hedge your answers. I suspect that is always the case. There's a deeper personal view on these matters. Perhaps your years of training at the United Nations have taught you to be robust in private discussion and slightly more elliptical in public. But I sense there's a tremendous amount of knowledge and insight and perspective on these from your years of experience. And I thank you very much indeed for addressing this evening. Thank you.